When bullets started flying at Forward Operating Base Phoenix, everyone expected the seasoned combat veterans to take charge. Nobody expected the quiet 22-year-old medic who'd been there just 3 weeks to become the difference between life and death for 37 soldiers trapped under enemy fire. The dust never settled at Forward Operating Base Phoenix. It hung in the air like a persistent reminder of where they were and how far they were from home. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos wiped the grit from her eyes as she stepped out of the medical tent, her boots crunching on the rocky ground beneath her feet. The Afghan sun blazed overhead, merciless in its intensity, but she had grown used to it during her brief time at the base. 3 weeks. That's how long she'd been stationed here, and already the other soldiers had made up their minds about her. The rookie medic. The newbie who jumped at every loud noise, the one who asked too many questions and moved too carefully around the wounded. She could see it in their eyes when they brought injured soldiers to her tent. They were polite, respectful even, but there was always that flicker of doubt. Would she know what to do when it really mattered? Maria had graduated top of her class from medic training at Fort Sam Houston. She had memorized every procedure, practiced every technique, until her hands could work without her mind having to think. But none of that seemed to matter here. Here, experience was everything, and she had none. The base medics who had been deployed multiple times would share stories of firefights and medical emergencies, while she listened quietly, knowing she had nothing to contribute to the conversation. Forward Operating Base Phoenix sat in a strategic valley in Helmand Province, home to roughly 200 American soldiers and a handful of Allied forces. It was considered a relatively quiet posting, which is probably why they had sent a rookie medic like her there. The base commander, Colonel James Mitchell, was a weathered man in his 50s who had seen more combat than most soldiers could imagine. He ran the base with efficient precision, but Maria had barely spoken to him beyond the initial briefing when she arrived. The base itself was a collection of temporary structures, surrounded by high concrete walls, topped with razor wire. Guard towers stood at each corner, manned around the clock by soldiers whose eyes never stopped scanning the surrounding landscape. Beyond the walls lay a world of rocky hills, sparse vegetation, and scattered villages where the line between friend and enemy was often impossible to determine. Maria shared living quarters with 3 other female soldiers in a small prefab building that felt more like a shipping container than a home. Her bunkmates were all veterans of previous deployments. There was Sergeant Lisa Chen, a communications specialist who could repair any radio equipment blindfolded. Corporal Amy Rodriguez worked in supply logistics and had an uncanny ability to acquire whatever the soldiers needed, often through means she preferred not to discuss. And then there was Private First Class Jessica Turner, barely 19 but already on her second deployment, working in intelligence analysis. They were kind to Maria, but she could feel the invisible wall between them. They had earned their place here through fire and blood. She was still trying to prove she belonged. The medical facility at Phoenix was more advanced than many forward operating bases, but it was still basic by civilian hospital standards. Maria had 2 other medics working under her supervision, both with more field experience than she had. Corporal David Kim had been deployed 4 times and had seen everything from IED explosions to sniper wounds. Specialist Robert Jackson was on his 3rd deployment and could stabilize a patient faster than most emergency room doctors back home. They respected her rank and followed her orders, but Maria could sense their uncertainty. When casualties came in, they would look to her for guidance, but their eyes would dart between her and each other, silently questioning whether she would make the right call. She tried to project confidence, but inside, the doubt gnawed at her. What if she froze up? What if she made a mistake that cost someone their life? The daily routine at Phoenix was predictable but tense. Morning briefings at 0600 hours, medical rounds at 0700, equipment checks throughout the day, and evening reports before lights out. Patrols went out every day, sometimes returning with minor injuries that Maria and her team would treat. Twisted ankles, cuts from razor wire, the occasional case of heat exhaustion. Nothing too serious, nothing that would test her abilities under pressure. But Maria knew that could change in an instant. She had heard the stories from other bases, other deployments. Enemy forces in the region had been unusually quiet lately, which made everyone nervous. The intelligence reports suggested they were planning something, but nobody knew what or when. During her 2nd week at the base, Maria had her first real test. A patrol hit an IED about 5 kilometers from Phoenix, and 2 soldiers were brought in with serious injuries. One had shrapnel wounds to his legs and torso. The other had suffered a concussion and possible internal bleeding. Maria's training kicked in immediately. She triaged the patients, directed Kim and Jackson in their treatment, and managed to stabilize both soldiers until they could be evacuated to a larger medical facility. The operation went smoothly, but Maria could see the surprise in everyone's eyes. Maybe the rookie did know what she was doing after all. But one successful treatment didn't erase weeks of doubt, and Maria knew she still had a long way to go to earn their full trust. Colonel Mitchell had noticed her work that day and made a point to visit the medical facility afterward. He was a man of few words, but he told Maria that she had handled the situation well. It was the first real encouragement she had received since arriving at Phoenix, and it meant more to her than he probably realized. The base had its share of characters, soldiers who had found ways to cope with the stress and monotony of deployment. There was Sergeant Major Tom Brady, a massive man from Texas who could fix anything mechanical and told stories that were probably half true and completely entertaining. He had taken a liking to Maria and would stop by the medical tent regularly, ostensibly to check on supplies, but really just to chat and make sure she was settling in okay. Then there was Lieutenant Sarah Williams, the intelligence officer who seemed to know everything that was happening within a 50-kilometer radius of the base. She was quiet and analytical, but Maria had noticed that she always seemed to be watching, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Williams had been friendly but distant with Maria, treating her with the same polite professionalism she showed everyone else. The soldiers who came through Maria's medical tent were a cross-section of American youth. Farm boys from Iowa, city kids from New York, college graduates looking to pay off student loans, and career soldiers who had made the military their life. Each had their own story, their own reasons for being there, and their own way of dealing with the stress of deployment. Some were cocky and fearless, at least on the surface. They would joke about the danger and act like nothing could touch them. Others were more thoughtful and serious, understanding the risks they faced every time they left the base. All of them, Maria had noticed, carried a weight that was invisible but unmistakable. The weight of being far from home in a place where death could come from any direction at any moment. Maria tried to be there for all of them. Not just when they were injured, but when they needed someone to talk to. She had discovered that being a medic was about more than treating wounds. Sometimes a soldier just needed someone to listen, someone who wouldn't judge them for being scared or homesick or angry. She found that she was good at this part of the job, maybe better than she was at the medical procedures. The days at Phoenix began to blur together. Wake up, briefing, rounds, equipment checks, treat minor injuries, paperwork, sleep, repeat. Maria fell into the routine, but she never let herself get completely comfortable. She knew that complacency was dangerous in a place like this. Every night before she went to sleep, she would run through medical procedures in her head, visualizing different scenarios and how she would respond to them. She also spent time getting to know the base layout better. She memorized every building, every defensive position, every possible route between the medical facility and other key locations. It was probably unnecessary, but something told her that knowledge like this might be important someday. The other soldiers had begun to warm up to her gradually. Sergeant Brady would bring her coffee in the mornings and update her on the latest gossip from around the base. Corporal Rodriguez had started including her in conversations about life back home. Even Private Turner, who was usually focused entirely on her intelligence work, had begun asking Maria about her medical training and sharing stories from her previous deployment. But, Maria could still feel the underlying current of doubt. She was competent, sure, but was she tested? Could she handle a real crisis when everything was falling apart and lives hung in the balance? She hoped she would never have to find out, but deep down she knew that hope was probably naive. The intelligence reports had become increasingly concerning over the past few days. Lieutenant Williams had mentioned during morning briefings that enemy activity in the region was increasing. There had been several probing attacks on other bases, and captured communications suggested that Phoenix might be a target. Security was increased, patrols were modified, and everyone was told to be extra vigilant. Maria found herself checking and rechecking her medical supplies, making sure everything was ready for whatever might come. She drilled Kim and Jackson on mass casualty procedures, even though they both had more experience with that kind of situation than she did. They humored her, understanding that preparation was her way of dealing with anxiety. The atmosphere at the base had changed subtly but unmistakably. Conversations were quieter, jokes were fewer, and everyone seemed to be listening for sounds that didn't belong. The soldiers manning the guard towers spent longer looking through their scopes, scanning the surrounding hills for any sign of movement. Patrol leaders double-checked their routes and made sure their communications equipment was working perfectly. Colonel Mitchell called a base-wide meeting to address the increasing tension. He was characteristically blunt, telling everyone that intelligence suggested an attack was possible, but that Phoenix was well defended and ready for anything. He reminded them of their training, their duty, and their commitment to each other. Maria listened from the back of the room, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. If something happened, soldiers would be counting on her to save their lives. That night, as she lay in her bunk listening to the distant sound of generators and radio chatter, Maria thought about her family back home in California. Her parents had been proud but worried when she deployed. Her younger brother had made her promise to come home safely. Her best friend from high school had cried when they said goodbye at the airport. They all seemed so far away now, like they existed in a different world entirely. She thought about her training, about all the instructors who had prepared her for this moment. They had taught her procedures and techniques, but they couldn't teach her what it felt like to have real responsibility for real people in real danger. That was something she would have to learn on her own, and she prayed she would be ready when the time came. The base grew quiet as midnight approached, but Maria noticed that the usual sounds of soldiers settling in for the night were missing. Everyone seemed to be staying awake a little longer, listening a little more carefully. Even the desert seemed different somehow, as if it was holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. Maria finally drifted off to sleep around 0100, but her dreams were filled with images of wounded soldiers and medical emergencies she couldn't handle. She woke up several times during the night, each time listening for sounds of trouble that never came. When morning finally arrived, she felt like she hadn't slept at all, but she forced herself to get up and begin another day. The morning briefing confirmed what everyone already suspected. Intelligence intercepts suggested that an attack on Phoenix was not just possible, but likely. The enemy had been moving personnel and equipment into the area over the past week, and several communications had mentioned the base specifically. All patrols were suspended until further notice, and the base was placed on high alert. Maria spent the morning going through her medical supplies one more time, making sure she had everything she might need for a mass casualty situation. She organized bandages, checked drug supplies, tested equipment, and created a mental inventory of everything at her disposal. Kim and Jackson watched her work, understanding her nervous energy but not knowing how to help. The afternoon passed slowly, with everyone on edge but nothing happening. Some soldiers tried to distract themselves with cards or books, but most found it impossible to focus on anything other than the possibility of attack. The guard towers reported several suspicious movements in the surrounding hills, but nothing definite enough to act on. As the sun began to set over the Afghan landscape, casting long shadows across the base, Maria felt a growing sense of dread. Something was coming. She could feel it in her bones. She just hoped she would be ready for whatever it was. The first explosion came at 03:47 hours, shattering the pre-dawn silence like a sledgehammer through glass. Maria jolted awake in her bunk, her heart hammering against her ribs as the building shook around her. For a split second, she wondered if she was dreaming, but the second explosion, closer and more powerful than the first, erased any doubt. Incoming! Incoming! All personnel to defensive positions. The voice over the base loudspeakers belonged to Colonel Mitchell, but Maria had never heard it sound so urgent, so sharp with barely controlled alarm. The lights flickered and went out as Maria scrambled out of her bunk, muscle memory guiding her hands to her gear in the darkness. Around her, she could hear her bunkmates doing the same, their breathing quick and shallow. Private Turner was muttering prayers under her breath in Spanish, while Corporal Rodriguez cursed steadily in English. Medical personnel to stations immediately. We have casualties incoming. The radio crackled with urgent voices as reports flooded in from around the base. Guard Tower 2 was taking heavy fire. The motor pool had been hit. The communications building was partially collapsed. Maria's training took over, pushing down the fear that threatened to paralyze her. She pulled on her boots, grabbed her medical bag, and headed for the door. Outside, the world had transformed into something from a nightmare. Tracer rounds streaked across the dark sky like deadly fireworks, and the distinct crack of incoming mortar rounds filled the air. Emergency lighting cast everything in an eerie red glow that made the shadows dance and shift. She ran toward the medical facility, keeping low and zigzagging between buildings as her instructors had taught her. Bullets whined overhead, and she could hear the distinctive sound of AK-47 fire mixing with the heavier reports of American weapons. The attackers had coordinated their assault perfectly, hitting multiple points around the perimeter simultaneously. When she reached the medical tent, Kim and Jackson were already there, frantically setting up triage areas and preparing supplies. Both men looked scared but focused, their hands moving with practiced efficiency, even as explosions continued to rock the base around them. "What's the situation?" Maria called out over the noise of gunfire. "Multiple breaches in the perimeter," Kim shouted back, not stopping his work. "Tower 2 is down, and we've got wounded coming in from the eastern wall. They hit us with mortars first, then infantry assault. This is coordinated, Doc. This is big." As if summoned by his words, the first casualties arrived. 2 soldiers carried in a third between them, his left leg mangled below the knee by shrapnel. Blood soaked through his uniform pants, and his face was grey with shock. Behind them came more wounded, a steady stream of soldiers with injuries ranging from minor cuts to life-threatening trauma. Maria's world narrowed to the immediate tasks in front of her. Years of training compressed into instinctive action as she began triaging patients, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. The soldier with the mangled leg was her first priority. She quickly assessed his injuries, started an IV line, and began working to control the bleeding while directing Kim to prepare for emergency surgery. "We need to get a tourniquet on this leg now," she called out, her voice cutting through the noise with surprising authority. "Jackson, I need you to start blood typing. We're going to need plasma, and we're going to need it fast." The wounded soldier was conscious but fading fast. Maria leaned close to his ear as she worked. "Hey, soldier, what's your name?" "Thompson," he gasped through gritted teeth. "Private First Class Mike Thompson." "Well, Mike, you picked a hell of a night to get yourself shot up," Maria said, keeping her tone light even as her hands worked frantically to save his leg. "But you're going to be fine. I'm going to take good care of you, okay?" Thompson managed a weak smile despite his pain. Something in Maria's voice, some unshakable confidence, seemed to calm him even as mortar rounds continued to explode nearby. More casualties kept coming. A staff sergeant with severe burns on his arms and face from an explosion. A young private who couldn't have been older than 19 with a bullet wound to his shoulder. A sergeant major who had taken shrapnel to his back and was having trouble breathing. Each patient required immediate attention, and Maria found herself moving between them like a conductor orchestrating a deadly symphony. What struck her most was how quickly her nervous energy had transformed into focused determination. The doubt and uncertainty that had plagued her for weeks simply evaporated under pressure. Her hands knew what to do. Her mind processed information and made decisions with clarity she had never experienced before, and her voice carried a confidence that surprised even her. "Kim, I need you on the staff sergeant with the burns," she called out while working to stabilize Thompson's leg. "Get saline irrigation going and prep for debridement. Jackson, the shoulder wound looks clean, but we need to make sure there's no arterial damage." Lieutenant Williams burst into the medical tent, her usually calm demeanor cracked by stress and urgency. "Santos, I need to know how many wounded you can handle. We've got reports of more casualties at the eastern perimeter, but I can't spare any more soldiers to carry them back here." "How many more?" Maria asked without looking up from her patient. "At least 6, maybe more. 2 of them are in bad shape." Maria made a split-second calculation. The medical tent was already at capacity with current patients, and her 2 assistants were fully occupied with critical cases. But soldiers were dying out there, and every minute of delay reduced their chances of survival. "I'll go get them," she said, causing everyone in the tent to stop what they were doing and stare at her. "Dark, you can't," Kim protested. "It's too dangerous out there." "You're needed here, and those soldiers are needed alive," Maria shot back. "You and Jackson can handle these patients for 15 minutes. I'm going to bring back the others." Before anyone could argue further, she grabbed her medical bag and a portable stretcher and headed for the exit. Williams caught her arm as she passed. "Santos, I can't order you to do this. It's not part of your duties." Maria looked directly into the intelligence officer's eyes. "With respect, Lieutenant, saving soldiers' lives is exactly my duty. How do I get to the eastern perimeter?" Williams hesitated for just a moment, then gave her quick directions. "Follow the main road east until you reach the junction, then take the dirt path north. But Santos, if you run into heavy resistance, you turn around and come back. We can't afford to lose you." The journey to the eastern perimeter was like traveling through a war zone, which, Maria realized, was exactly what it was. Mortar rounds continued to fall at irregular intervals, sending up geysers of dirt and debris. Machine gun fire rattled back and forth across the base as American forces and enemy infiltrators engaged in deadly firefights among the buildings. Maria kept low and moved fast, using whatever cover she could find. Her medical training had included basic combat movement, but she had never imagined she would need to use it. Now she found herself crawling under vehicles, sprinting between buildings, and diving for cover as bullets snapped overhead. She reached the eastern perimeter to find a scene of devastation. A mortar round had scored a direct hit on a guard post, and the explosion had wounded 6 soldiers. 2 were already dead, their bodies covered by ponchos. The other 4 were in various stages of critical condition, tended by a corporal who was trying his best with basic first aid, but was clearly out of his depth. "Thank God you're here, Doc," the corporal called out as Maria approached. I don't know what to do for half of these guys. Maria quickly assessed the situation. One soldier had severe abdominal injuries and was unconscious. Another had multiple shrapnel wounds and was going into shock. The third had a head injury that was bleeding heavily but appeared stable. The fourth had crush injuries to his legs from falling debris. It was a medic's nightmare. Multiple critical patients with life-threatening injuries, no advanced medical equipment, and ongoing enemy fire making evacuation dangerous. But Maria felt something she had never felt before in her life. Complete absolute certainty about what needed to be done. Okay, here's what we're going to do, she said, her voice calm and authoritative. The abdominal wound is our priority. I need to stabilize him for transport. You help me get pressure dressings on the shrapnel wounds while I work. We're going to move them one at a time, most critical first. For the next hour, Maria worked with an efficiency and skill that would have impressed her instructors back at Fort Sam Houston. She performed emergency procedures under fire that many veteran medics had never attempted. She made life-or-death decisions with split-second timing and executed them flawlessly. The soldier with abdominal injuries required immediate surgery to have any chance of survival. Maria managed to stabilize his condition enough for transport by performing a battlefield procedure that involved inserting a chest tube while mortar rounds exploded nearby. Her hands never shook, her focus never wavered. One by one, she and the corporal managed to get the wounded soldiers back to the medical facility. Each trip was a nightmare of enemy fire and exploding ordnance. But Maria never hesitated. She moved through the chaos like she had been doing it her entire life, making split-second decisions about routes and timing that kept them all alive. When they arrived back at the medical tent with the last casualty, Maria found that Kim and Jackson had managed the original patient successfully. Thompson's leg had been stabilized, the staff sergeant's burns were cleaned and dressed, and the other wounded soldiers were stable and ready for evacuation to a larger medical facility. But the night was far from over. Reports continued to come in of wounded soldiers throughout the base, and enemy forces were still fighting to maintain their foothold inside the perimeter. Maria realized that this was going to be the longest and most challenging night of her life. Colonel Mitchell appeared at the medical tent around 0600 hours, just as the first hints of dawn were beginning to show on the eastern horizon. His uniform was torn and dirty, and there was a bandage on his left arm, but his eyes were alert and focused. "Santos, I need a status report on casualties," he said without preamble. 17 wounded, treated and stabilized, Colonel," Maria replied, without hesitation. 12 ready for evacuation, 5 stable enough to remain on base. 2 KIA at the eastern perimeter. Mitchell studied her face for a moment, and Maria could see something changing in his expression. The doubt that had been there before, the uncertainty about the rookie medic, was gone. In its place was something she had been working toward for weeks: respect. "Outstanding work, Sergeant. How are your supplies holding up?" "We're getting low on plasma and morphine, but we can handle whatever else comes our way," Maria said. "My team has performed exceptionally under pressure."
"And so have you," Mitchell said quietly.
"I've been getting reports from all over the base about your actions tonight. Going out to retrieve wounded soldiers under fire isn't something I would have expected from someone with your level of experience." Maria met his gaze steadily. "Experience isn't just about time served, Colonel. Sometimes it's about being willing to do what needs to be done when lives are on the line." Mitchell nodded slowly. "Indeed it is, Sergeant. Indeed it is." As the colonel left to continue his rounds, Maria looked around at the organized chaos of her medical facility. Kim and Jackson were still working steadily on patients, but she could see something different in their faces too. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by confidence in their leader and pride in what they had accomplished together. The attack on Forward Operating Base Phoenix continued for another 3 hours, but the tide had clearly turned. American forces had contained the infiltrators and were systematically clearing them from the base. The mortar attacks had stopped, and the sound of gunfire was becoming more sporadic. By 0900 hours, the base was secure. The enemy forces had been eliminated or had withdrawn, leaving behind evidence of what had been a carefully planned and coordinated assault. Intelligence would later determine that over 50 enemy fighters had participated in the attack, making it one of the largest assaults on an American base in the region that year. But Maria didn't know those details yet. All she knew was that she had treated 19 wounded soldiers during the longest night of her life, and all 19 were still alive. She had performed procedures under fire that she had only practiced in training. She had made decisions that saved lives, and had led her team with a confidence she didn't know she possessed. As she finally sat down for the first time in 6 hours, Maria felt the exhaustion hit her like a physical weight. Her hands, which had been steady and sure throughout the night, now began to shake slightly as the adrenaline wore off. But underneath the exhaustion was something else. A deep satisfaction and a quiet confidence that would never leave her. The rookie medic who had arrived at Forward Operating Base Phoenix 3 weeks ago was gone, transformed by fire and pressure into something harder, more capable, and infinitely more confident. She had passed a test she didn't know she was taking and had discovered reserves of courage and skills she never knew she had. The silence felt strange after hours of gunfire and explosions. Maria sat outside the medical tent, watching the sun climb higher into the Afghan sky, painting the devastated base in golden light that seemed almost obscene after the darkness of the night. Smoke still rose from several buildings, and the acrid smell of cordite and burning equipment hung in the air like a toxic perfume. Around her, Forward Operating Base Phoenix was slowly coming back to life. Soldiers emerged from defensive positions, their faces marked by exhaustion, relief, and the 1,000-yard stare that came after intense combat. Some walked with the confident swagger of veterans who had survived another firefight. Others moved more slowly, processing what they had experienced and what it meant for their understanding of their own mortality. Maria felt different from all of them. She felt like she had been fundamentally changed at the molecular level, transformed from one thing into something entirely different. The nervous, doubting medic who had gone to sleep the night before no longer existed. In her place sat someone who had looked death in the eye and hadn't blinked, someone who had made life and death decisions under the most extreme pressure imaginable and had made them correctly. Corporal Kim approached her, carrying 2 cups of coffee that looked like they had been brewed with muddy water. He sat down beside her without speaking and handed her one of the cups. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts about the night they had survived. "You know, Doc," Kim finally said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders and breathing smoke, "I've been deployed 4 times, and I've served with a lot of medics. Some were good, some were okay, and a few were absolutely outstanding." He paused and took a sip of the terrible coffee. "What you did last night was something else entirely." Maria looked at him, surprised by the emotion in his voice. "I just did what I was trained to do." Kim shook his head slowly. "No, that's not right. Training doesn't teach you to run into enemy fire to retrieve wounded soldiers. Training doesn't give you the kind of calm focus you showed when we had 19 critical patients and limited supplies. That's something else. Something that can't be taught." Before Maria could respond, Specialist Jackson appeared around the corner of the medical tent, his uniform still stained with blood from the night's work. He looked exhausted but satisfied, like a man who had done important work and done it well. "Doc, I just got word from the evacuation team," he said. "All 12 patients we sent out are stable and expected to make full recoveries. Thompson is going to keep his leg, thanks to that tourniquet work you did under fire." He paused and grinned. "He specifically asked me to tell you that if you ever need anything, anywhere, anytime, you just have to ask." Maria felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the terrible coffee. Knowing that her decisions and actions had directly saved Thompson's leg, and probably his life, made every terrifying moment of the previous night worthwhile. The base began to return to some semblance of normal operations as the morning progressed. Damage assessment teams surveyed the destruction and began planning repairs. Security patrols were established to ensure no enemy fighters remained in the area. Intelligence officers started the process of analyzing the attack to understand how it had been planned and executed. But Maria noticed something different in how people looked at her as she moved around the base. The polite but distant respect she had received as the rookie medic was gone, replaced by something warmer and more genuine. Soldiers who had never spoken to her before stopped to thank her or ask about her well-being. Officers who had barely acknowledged her existence now made a point to greet her by name. Sergeant Major Brady found her during the afternoon, while she was reorganizing her medical supplies and taking inventory of what needed to be resupplied. The big Texan looked uncharacteristically serious as he approached, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by something more somber. "Sergeant Santos, I wanted to personally thank you for what you did for my boys last night," he said, his voice thick with emotion. 3 of the soldiers you treated are from my unit. Good kids, all of them. They're going to go home to their families because of what you did." Maria felt her throat tighten. "I was just doing my job, Sergeant Major." Brady shook his head emphatically. "No, ma'am. Your job is to treat wounded soldiers in the medical facility. What you did was go above and beyond in a way that most people never could. You saved lives by putting your own life at risk, and that's something special." He paused and looked directly into her eyes. "I've been in the Army for 23 years, and I've served with some truly exceptional soldiers. Heroes, most people would call them. What you did last night puts you in that category, and I wanted you to know that." As Brady walked away, Maria felt overwhelmed by the weight of what had happened to her. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been struggling to gain the respect and confidence of her fellow soldiers. Now she was being called a hero by a sergeant major with over 2 decades of experience. The transformation felt surreal, like she was living in someone else's life. Colonel Mitchell called a base-wide meeting that evening to debrief the attack and recognize the soldiers who had performed exceptionally during the firefight. Maria found herself sitting in the front row, along with other soldiers who were being commended for their actions. She felt uncomfortable with the attention but understood that it was important for morale and unit cohesion. Last night, Forward Operating Base Phoenix came under the most serious attack it has faced since its establishment. Mitchell began, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the packed room. The enemy coordinated a sophisticated assault designed to inflict maximum casualties and damage to our operations. He went on to describe the tactical situation, the enemy's approach, and the response by American forces. Maria listened with interest, learning for the first time about aspects of the battle she had been too busy to notice during the actual fighting. But what I want to focus on tonight, Mitchell continued, are the acts of exceptional courage and skill that turned what could have been a disaster into a demonstration of American military excellence. His eyes found Maria in the crowd. Sergeant Santos, please stand up.
Maria felt her face flush as she rose to her feet, acutely aware that every eye in the room was focused on her.
She had never been comfortable being the center of attention, and this was more attention than she had ever received in her life. Sergeant Santos arrived at this base 3 weeks ago as our new senior medic, Mitchell said, his voice carrying a note of pride that surprised Maria. She was inexperienced in combat operations, and I'll be honest, some of us wondered how she would perform under pressure. There was complete silence in the room. Maria could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Last night, Sergeant Santos answered that question in the most definitive way possible. She treated 19 wounded soldiers under enemy fire, performing advanced medical procedures that saved lives and prevented permanent disabilities. She left the safety of the medical facility multiple times to retrieve wounded soldiers who would have died without immediate attention. Mitchell paused and looked directly at Maria. She displayed the kind of courage under fire that we associate with our most decorated combat veterans, and she did it with the skill and composure of a surgeon in a fully equipped hospital. Her actions directly saved multiple lives and are a credit to her training, her character, and the United States Army. The applause that followed was thunderous and sustained. Maria stood there feeling simultaneously proud and embarrassed, honored and overwhelmed. She caught sight of Kim and Jackson in the crowd, both beaming with pride like proud parents. Sergeant Major Brady was applauding enthusiastically, and even the usually stoic Lieutenant Williams was smiling. When the applause finally died down, Mitchell continued his remarks, recognizing other soldiers who had performed admirably during the battle. But Maria barely heard the rest of the ceremony. She was processing the realization that her life had fundamentally changed over the course of a single night, and there was no going back to who she had been before. After the ceremony, soldiers approached her throughout the evening to offer congratulations and share their own thoughts about the battle. Many thanked her personally for her actions, and several shared details about the soldiers she had treated that she hadn't known before. Thompson, the soldier whose leg she had saved, had a 3-year-old daughter back home in Ohio. The staff sergeant with burns was planning to propose to his girlfriend when he got back to the States. Each story made her actions feel more meaningful and more personal. Private Turner found Maria later that evening, after most of the celebration had wound down and soldiers were beginning to return to their quarters. The young intelligence analyst looked like she had something important to say but wasn't sure how to say it. Sergeant Santos, I wanted to talk to you about something. Turner began hesitantly. I've been thinking about what happened last night, and I realized something important. Maria sat down beside her, curious about what the usually quiet soldier wanted to discuss. When you first got here, I thought you were just another inexperienced medic, who would probably do okay but wouldn't really understand what we were dealing with out here, Turner continued. I figured you'd learn eventually, or maybe you'd get transferred somewhere safer. She paused and looked directly at Maria. But I was wrong about what makes someone ready for this kind of situation. I thought it was about experience and time in combat, but what you showed last night was something different. You showed that when people's lives are on the line, you become exactly who they need you to be. Maria felt touched by the young soldier's words, especially coming from someone who had initially been distant and professional. Thank you, Jessica. That means a lot coming from you. There's something else, Turner added. I want you to know that I put in a request to extend my deployment here. I could have rotated back to a rear area assignment, but I want to stay here and serve under your medical supervision. After what I saw last night, I can't imagine serving anywhere else. As Turner walked away, Maria reflected on how completely her situation had changed. 3 weeks ago, soldiers had been polite but distant, questioning her abilities and wondering if she was ready for combat operations.
Now they were requesting to serve under her leadership and describing her actions as heroic.
The following days brought a stream of visitors to Forward Operating Base Phoenix. Senior officers came to assess the damage and investigate how the enemy had managed to mount such a sophisticated attack. Medical personnel from other bases visited to study Maria's treatment protocols and learn from her experience managing mass casualties under fire. A reporter from Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, arrived to write a story about the battle and specifically about Maria's actions during the attack. She was uncomfortable with the interview, not wanting to seem like she was seeking attention or glory, but she understood that her story might inspire other young soldiers and medics. What went through your mind when you decided to leave the safety of the medical facility to retrieve wounded soldiers? The reporter asked. Maria thought about the question carefully before answering. Honestly, I didn't really think about it at all. I just knew that soldiers were hurt and needed help, and I was the person best qualified to provide that help. The danger didn't seem relevant compared to the fact that people were dying. Were you scared? Of course I was scared. Anyone who says they weren't scared in that situation is either lying or crazy. But being scared doesn't mean you can't do your job. Sometimes being scared actually makes you more focused and more careful. The reporter pressed for more details about specific procedures and decisions, and Maria found herself describing the night in clinical terms that made her actions sound routine rather than heroic. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a soldier who had done what needed to be done when people were counting on her. But the story that appeared in Stars and Stripes painted a different picture. It described her as the rookie medic who moved like a Navy SEAL and detailed her actions in terms that made them sound like something out of an action movie. The headline read, "From Rookie to Hero, Young Medic Saves 19 Lives in Single Night." Maria cringed when she read the article, feeling like it made her sound more dramatic and self-important than she actually was. But Kim and Jackson loved it, proudly showing copies to anyone who would look and talking about how they had served with a genuine hero. More importantly, the article had an impact far beyond Forward Operating Base Phoenix. Medical training schools began using Maria's actions as case studies in battlefield medicine. Her techniques for managing mass casualties under fire were incorporated into training protocols. Young medics throughout the military read about her story and drew inspiration from it. A month after the attack, Maria received word that she was being recommended for the Bronze Star Medal for her actions during the battle. The recommendation emphasized her courage in retrieving wounded soldiers under fire and her exceptional skill in treating multiple critical patients with limited resources. She also received a letter from Thompson, the soldier whose leg she had saved. He was recovering well at a military hospital in Germany and expected to make a full recovery. He wrote that he was planning to return to active duty and hoped to serve with her again someday. The letter included a photo of his 3-year-old daughter holding a sign that read, "Thank you, Sergeant Santos." But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Maria received a package with no return address, containing a simple wooden plaque with an inscription that read, "To Sergeant Maria Santos, who proved that heroes aren't born, they're forged in the fire of doing what's right when everything else is going wrong. From the soldiers whose lives you saved." It was signed by all 19 soldiers she had treated during the attack. As her deployment continued, Maria found that her confidence and leadership abilities continued to grow. She began training other medics in the techniques she had developed during the attack, sharing her knowledge with soldiers who would face their own life and death situations. She discovered that she had a natural ability to teach and mentor, helping other young medics prepare for the challenges they would face. Colonel Mitchell began consulting with her on medical protocols and procedures for the entire base, treating her as a senior advisor despite her relatively junior rank and limited experience. Her opinions were sought on everything from equipment procurement to casualty evacuation procedures. When Maria's deployment ended 6 months later, she had been transformed from the nervous rookie who had arrived at Forward Operating Base Phoenix into one of the most respected medics in the military. She had proven that experience isn't just about time served, but about rising to meet challenges when lives hang in the balance. The night of the attack would stay with her forever, not as a traumatic memory, but as the moment she discovered who she really was and what she was capable of achieving. She had learnt that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of fear when people are counting on you. And she had learnt that sometimes When everything is falling apart and lives are on the line, an untested rookie can become exactly what everyone needs them to be. Sometimes the person who seems least likely to be a hero is precisely the person who will step forward when heroes are needed most. The doubt and uncertainty that had plagued her first weeks at Phoenix were gone forever, replaced by a quiet confidence born of tested ability and proven courage. She was no longer the rookie medic trying to prove herself. She was Sergeant Maria Santos, Bronze Star recipient, lifesaver, and leader. And she was just getting started.